Let me ask you something before the story begins. Have you ever given someone everything, your time, your loyalty, the softest and most unguarded parts of who you are, and watched them treat it like it meant nothing? Have you ever loved someone so completely that you stopped asking questions because the answers frightened you more than the lies? If you have, then this story is not just about Fred James. This story is about you. Welcome to Roses and Revolvers, where no one leaves untouched. If this story had your heart racing, you already know you can't stop here. Subscribe now, because the next confession? It's darker. And you won't want to hear about it from someone else. Drop your location in the comments. I want to know who's brave enough to stay. Fred James did not grow up soft. He grew up in the kind of hunger that teaches a child early that the world does not hand you anything, you take it, or you go without. He clawed his way out of the dust of Sicily with nothing but a sharp mind and a will that refused to break. He built an empire that made powerful men lower their eyes when he walked into a room. He turned loyalty into currency and fear into architecture. The streets answered to his name. But here is the thing about men who are invincible in the world. They are almost always devastatingly fragile at home. Because Fred James, the Lion of Sicily, the man whose enemies prayed he would never say their name, that same man would come home at night, take off the armor, and become something else entirely. He became a husband who believed. He believed in Maria the way the desperate believe in God, not because he had proof, but because he needed it to be true. He needed one thing in his violent, calculated life to be pure. He needed her to be real. And so he looked at every cold silence and told himself it was tiredness. He looked at every unexplained absence and called it space. He looked at every moment she flinched from his touch and chose not to know why. And John, his brother in everything but blood, the man who had stood beside him since boyhood, who knew every scar on his body and every secret in his empire. The man Fred would have died for without a second thought. He trusted them both with the one thing no amount of power can protect. He trusted them with his blind side. Then came the night on the coastal highway. The road curved sharply above the sea. The brakes gave nothing. The car went through the barrier like the world had simply decided it was time, and Fred James, the most feared man in southern Italy, fell into the dark water below like any ordinary man. Like a man who had never been anything at all. The doctors called him brain dead. They said it gently, the way people say things they have already decided. They noted his vitals on their charts. They dimmed the lights in the ICU. They gave his body the kind of careful, efficient attention reserved for a person they had already let go of in their minds. The machines breathed for him. The world mourned him briefly, the way the world mourns the powerful. With spectacle, with rumor, with whispers about who would take what he left behind. But inside that bed, inside that still, silent, motionless body, Fred James was awake. Not dreaming. Not fading. Not at peace. Awake. He could feel the sheets beneath his hands. He could hear every footstep in the corridor. He could smell the antiseptic cold of the room and the faint, expensive perfume of the woman who walked in on the third day, not crying, not broken. Not the woman who had promised before God and family to love him until the last breath left his body. She walked in laughing softly, carefully, at something John had said at the door. And then they were both there, beside his bed, and Fred heard the sound he will never in his life forget. The sound of two people relaxed. Not grieving. Not afraid. Relaxed. The way you are when something difficult is nearly finished. When the hard part is almost over. John's voice, low and familiar, saying numbers, accounts, assets, timelines. Maria's voice, the voice Fred had once said was the only sound that made his world feel worth it, saying soon. Just a little longer. We just need the papers signed. He could not open his eyes. He could not move a single finger. He could not make one sound to tell them. I hear you. I hear every word. I have always been here. And this is where life delivers its most savage lesson. Not in the crash. Not in the paralysis. Not even in the conspiracy itself. The lesson is this. The people who destroy us are almost never strangers. They're the ones we chose. The ones we defended when others warned us. The ones we loved loudly while they quietly sharpened the knife. Fred James did not lose Maria and John the night of the crash. He lost them in 100 small moments he refused to look at directly. In the compliment she never returned. In the meeting John canceled without explanation. In the way they sometimes looked at each other a half-second too long before looking away. He saw it all. He filed it somewhere deep and dark and locked the door. Because the truth is, and this is the hardest thing a human heart ever has to admit, sometimes we already know. We just love them too much to let ourselves. And that kind of love, beautiful as it feels, is also a form of self-destruction. It is handing someone the map to every vulnerable part of you and trusting them not to use it. It is choosing warmth over wisdom again and again, until the day the cold finally arrives and there is nowhere left to hide from it. Fred paid for that choice with his body, with his silence, with the unbearable dignity of lying still while the two people he loved most planned the cleanest way to finish what the cliff had started. He was a lion in a cage made of his own skin. Until a nurse on the night shift, a tired, underpaid, overlooked woman who had spent years watching people give up on patients too soon, leaned in close to check his pupils. And Fred James blinked. Once. Deliberately. With everything he had left. And she saw it. This is a story about betrayal, yes. About a mafia boss and a hospital bed and a revenge that will arrive like a verdict no court ever handed down. But more than that, this is a story about what it means to wake up. Not from a coma. From the comfortable, dangerous sleep of loving someone who was never really there. From the story you told yourself so you wouldn't have to grieve something you hadn't lost yet. This is a story about the moment a person finally decides, I see you clearly now. And I am still here. The rage is coming. The resurrection is coming. The reckoning is coming. But first, sit with this. Because somewhere in this story is a mirror. And the bravest thing you can do right now is look directly into it. There is a kind of man who builds not because he is ambitious, but because he is afraid that if he stops, the people he loves will finally see the emptiness underneath. Fred James was that man. At 41, he controlled more land than most Italian governors. His vineyard stretched across the hills of Sicily like a green, breathing promise, row after row of vines that the old farmers said produced the most honest wine in the country. His name was on the lips of senators who publicly condemned him and privately called him for favors. 3 cities ran on his money without ever saying so out loud. But none of it, not 1 acre, not 1 senator, not 1 bottle of wine, was built for Fred. Every single brick was laid for Maria. He had watched her once, early in their marriage, run her fingers along a bolt of raw silk in a Florence market. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't even looked at the price. She simply touched it the way a person touches something they've already accepted they cannot have. Fred bought the entire bolt before she turned around. That was who he was to her. Not a husband, a solution. A man who watched her eyes so carefully he could satisfy desires she hadn't yet spoken. He gave her a villa with 14 rooms and filled every one of them with the things that made her eyes go soft. Art. Silk. Stillness. Safety. He confused her comfort for her love. He confused her staying for her choosing. And Maria. Maria smiled at all of it. Said the right words. Held his face in her hands on the nights he came home bleeding and called him her lion. While somewhere in that 14-room villa, her phone screen glowed quietly in the dark. John's name on the screen. Unanswered for now. There is something uniquely devastating about celebrating with the person who is already planning your funeral. Fred did not know that yet. That night, the villa was alive in a way that only victory makes possible. The kind of night where the wine is too good, the laughter is too easy, and a man lets his guard down because he believes, truly believes, that he is finally completely safe. Fred had just dismantled the Caruso syndicate. 3 years of careful, dangerous work. 3 years of sleepless nights and calculated moves on a board most men couldn't even see. And it was over. The streets were his. Cicely breathed his name like a prayer. He poured John's glass himself. That was the kind of man Fred was. Even at the height of his power, he served the people he loved with his own hands. He raised the glass, looked John directly in the eye, those familiar eyes he had known since they were both barefoot boys running through the same dusty streets, and said the words he meant with everything inside him. "Without you, none of this exists. You are the only brother I have ever needed." John smiled. Warm. Easy. The smile of a man who had practiced it. He clinked his glass against Fred's and drank deeply. What Fred could not see, what the candlelight and the wine and 30 years of brotherhood made completely invisible, was that 3 hours earlier, John had sat in a parked car on a narrow street in Palermo and handed a corrupt mechanic named Russo an envelope thick with Fred's own money. The instructions inside were simple. The coastal highway. The Friday night drive Fred took alone every week without fail. The brake line. Make it clean. Russo had already said yes. The mechanic was already working. Nobody teaches you this in the stories they tell you about love. They show you the proposal. The wedding. The way someone looks at you across a crowded room like you are the only solid thing in a spinning world. They show you the beginning, always the beginning, because the beginning is beautiful and the truth is not. The truth is this. Some people do not fall in love with you. They fall in love with what you can absorb. Your patience. Your money. Your willingness to look away. They study you the way a jeweler studies a stone, not with affection, but with calculation. Turning you slowly in the light, assessing every facet, deciding quietly what you are worth and what it will take to finally cash you out. Maria James was doing exactly that on a Tuesday afternoon in Fred's private study. He was in Palermo. He trusted her completely. He had given her the codes to everything: the accounts, the safe, the filing cabinet where men with far less honor kept their most dangerous secrets. He had handed her the architecture of his entire life and called it intimacy. She sat at his desk with a leather notebook and a pen, and she went through everything. Methodically. Quietly. The Sicilian properties, she assigned each one a number. The offshore accounts, she noted the balances with the detached efficiency of an auditor. The vineyard alone, she wrote, was worth more than most men earn in 3 lifetimes. She did not look overwhelmed. She did not look guilty. She looked satisfied, like a woman who had finally finished a very long and tedious job. She closed the notebook, smoothed her dress, and picked up her phone. John answered on the first ring. "It's more than we thought," she said softly. A pause. Then John's voice, barely a whisper. "Then we cannot afford to wait any longer. If you made it this far, you're not just watching, you're part of this story now. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one." Here is what nobody tells you about betrayal. It never arrives wearing a villain's face. It does not announce itself. It does not feel monstrous to the people committing it. It feels, and this is the most dangerous thing about it, it feels justified. John and Maria did not meet that night in darkness and whisper like criminals. They met in the warm light of a private room above a restaurant in Catania. They shared a bottle of wine. They held hands across the table like two people who had finally, after a very long time, chosen themselves. And they talked about Fred James, the man who had loved them both more than he had ever loved his own survival, like he was a problem they had patiently endured long enough. "He will never let me go," Maria said. "You know that. Leaving is not an option. Not with what he knows. Not with who he is." John nodded slowly. He had rehearsed his conscience into silence weeks ago. After Friday, he said quietly, "You won't have to." They spoke about Russo. About the coastal highway. About the brake line and the curve above the sea where the barrier was weakest. They spoke about it the way ordinary people speak about travel plans, practically, efficiently, with the mild relief of people wrapping up a complicated arrangement. What they did not speak about What neither of them dared to name out loud was the 30 years of loyalty Fred had poured into John, like a man filling a vessel that was always, secretly, cracked. The sacrifices Fred had made to protect them both. The nights he had bled so they could sleep safely. Betrayal always rewrites that history first. It has to. Otherwise, the hand cannot move. John paid the bill. Maria straightened her coat. And Friday. Friday was only 3 days away. Friday came the way all devastating things come. Quietly. Ordinarily. Like any other day. Fred drove alone the way he always did on Friday nights. The coastal highway was his ritual, the 1 hour in the week where the empire fell away, and he was just a man behind a wheel with the Mediterranean sprawling black and infinite beside him. He played no music. He made no calls. He simply drove and breathed and allowed himself, for 60 minutes, to feel something close to peace. He was thinking about Maria when it started. Of course he was. The first curve came and the brake pedal sank too easily, soft, wrong, like pressing your foot into something that was no longer there. Fred's body knew before his mind did. Every instinct he had built across 40 years of surviving impossible situations fired at once. He pumped the pedal. Nothing. He grabbed the handbrake. It gave a sickening resistance and then nothing. The road curved left. The car did not. And here is what they never show you in the movies, the moment between when you understand what is happening and when it actually happens. That fraction of a second that stretches like a lifetime. Fred James, the Lion of Sicily, the man who had never once begged for anything. In that moment he thought of nothing grand. No empire. No enemies. No legacy. He thought of a boy running barefoot through dusty Sicilian streets. He thought of how badly he had simply wanted to be loved. Then the barrier shattered like it was made of nothing, and the world tilted completely, and the sea rushed up to meet him with a violence that made the word crash feel laughably small. The water swallowed everything. The silence that followed was absolute. And somewhere in Catania, Maria's phone lit up with Russo's message. It's done. Darkness is not empty. Nobody tells you that. They speak about unconsciousness like it is a blink, merciful nothing, a pause between one moment and the next. But Fred James did not get mercy. He got everything. He heard the doctors first. Their voices clinical and distant, speaking about him the way people speak about weather, observable, impersonal, already decided. Severe cerebral trauma. Vegetative state. Prepare the family. He heard the machines breathing for him, steady and indifferent, keeping alive a body the world had already begun to bury. He could not open his eyes. He could not move a single finger. He could not scream, and God, how he wanted to scream. He was a lion sealed inside his own skin. Fully present. Fully aware. Completely, horrifyingly alone inside a body that had become a prison with no door. Then Maria came. Fred felt her presence before he heard her voice. That familiar perfume, the one he had flown in specially from Paris, because she mentioned once, that she loved it. The scent he had associated for 15 years with safety and home and the particular tenderness of being known. She stood beside his bed. And she sighed. Not the sigh of a broken woman. The sigh of someone setting down a heavy bag after a very long journey. Relieved. Finished. Then John's voice, low and warm beside her. The lawyer says 2 weeks. Maybe less. Good, Maria said simply. Fred lay completely still, breathing through a machine. Tears he could not shed burning somewhere deep behind eyes that would not open. But something else was happening beneath that stillness. Something cold and ancient and precise was waking up inside him. He began to listen. Carefully. Completely. Every word they spoke. He stored like ammunition. Life has a quiet way of sending help that does not look like help. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself. It comes in the form of an underpaid woman on a night shift who has seen enough suffering to still take it personally. Who has not yet learned the dangerous professional habit of looking without seeing. Her name was Elena, 34 years old, single mother, 12-hour shifts. The kind of woman the world consistently overlooks because she does not demand to be seen, she is too busy seeing others. She had been assigned to Fred's room almost by accident, a scheduling gap nobody else wanted filled. He was brain dead, after all. The interesting cases were elsewhere. Fred James was simply a body that needed monitoring until the paperwork caught up with the prognosis. Elena did not treat him that way. She talked to him while she worked. Small things: the weather outside, the difficult drive in, a story about her son's first lost tooth. Not because she expected a response, but because she believed, in the quiet, unfashionable way of people who have sat beside enough bedsides, that something inside a person always remains. That consciousness is not a light switch. That presence cannot always be measured on a chart. On the 9th night, she leaned close to check his pupils. And Fred James, with every molecule of will left in his broken body, blinked. Once. Deliberate. Controlled. Elena froze. She looked at him for a long, suspended moment, the world perfectly still around them both. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "Can you hear me?" Blink once for yes. The silence stretched like a held breath. And then, Fred blinked. Elena straightened slowly. Her hands were trembling. Because she understood immediately, with absolute devastating clarity, that this was not a medical situation anymore. This was a man who had heard everything. There is a kind of pain that breaks you. And then there is the kind you choose, the kind you walk into deliberately, eyes open, because the alternative is lying down and letting the people who betrayed you win. Fred James chose the second kind every single night. Between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, when the ward was quiet and Maria was asleep in the villa Fred had built with his own hands, Elena would close the blinds, lock the door, and the Lion of Sicily would begin the most important war of his life. Not against an enemy. Against his own body. Finger exercises first. The effort it took to curl a single finger would have made lesser men weep. Fred did not weep. He pressed his teeth together and moved the finger again. And again. And again. Until the nerve pathways that the crash had scrambled began, slowly, agonizingly, to remember themselves. Then the wrist. Then the forearm. Then, after 3 weeks of nocturnal agony, he could grip Elena's hand with a pressure she described as terrifying for a man in his condition. He was not recovering. He was resurrecting. And every morning, when the day shift arrived, when footsteps he now recognized as Maria's clicked down the corridor, Fred would still himself completely. Slow his breathing. Sink back into the performance of a man who is nothing. He would lie there, motionless, while she stood over him. Sometimes she spoke to John on the phone without even stepping outside. And Fred would listen. Store it. File it in the cold, precise archive his mind had become. Because here is what betrayal teaches you if you survive it. Stillness is not weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is wait. Then one morning Elena entered the room ashen-faced, hands shaking. "Fred," she whispered. "John has filed the paperwork. They've scheduled a court date." She paused. "You have 11 days. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from." Now, they chose a Saturday for the wedding. The same villa Fred built. The same vineyard where he had once watched Maria touch silk like it was something sacred. They had dressed it in white flowers and soft lighting and the comfortable confidence of people who believed the hardest part was already behind them. They were wrong. The ceremony had barely begun when the doors opened. Not dramatically. Not with noise or spectacle. Simply opened. And Fred James walked through them. Slowly. With a cane. With 11 days of stolen recovery written into every careful step. But upright. Present. Undeniable. The room stopped breathing. Maria's face did not show guilt first. It showed something worse, pure, naked calculation. Even now, even caught, her mind was already searching for the exit. John showed fear. The specific fear of a man who suddenly remembers every single thing he has done. Fred did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood at the entrance of the room he had built and looked at them both with the eyes of a man who had spent weeks lying still, listening and deciding exactly what justice looked like. His lawyers were already outside. The accounts frozen. The properties transferred. The recordings Elena had helped him make of every bedside conversation, already in the hands of people John could not reach or threaten or buy. He stripped them of everything without touching them once. And then, because Fred James had learned something in that hospital bed that no amount of power had ever taught him before, he turned and walked away. Because here is the final truth this story carries. Loyalty is not given by people who have options. It is revealed by people who have every reason to leave and choose to stay. Fred James had survived the crash, survived the silence, survived the betrayal. But the man who walked out of that villa was not the same man who went over the cliff. That man was finally completely free,